The number written in her father's hand was $89.89. Coralie Audet saw it clearly when the man across the table slid the paper toward her father. Not toward her, never toward her, and her father's thick fingers pressed flat against the page as if he could hold down his own shame. He didn't look up. He hadn't looked at her since breakfast, which he now understood had been a kind of goodbye he lacked the courage to name. She was 22 years old. She had a winter coat with a broken button, a carpetbag that smelled of cedar and old bread, and a mother 3 years in the ground who could not save her. Outside the notary's window, the Saint gunned. Lawrence was running gray and fast under an October sky the color of dirty wool. The man who paid for her was named Lucien Gagnon. He sat across the table like a stone formation, immovable, weathered, disinterested in the drama unfolding around him. His hands rested on the table, massive and road-mapped with old scars. His jaw was buried under a dark beard going silver at the edges. He was 41 years old, a widower, a timber contractor who worked the Laurentian highlands above Sainte-Adèle. He had 4 children under the age of 14, and a cook who had quit in September after the eldest boy threw a full pot of porridge against the wall. He had not come to the notary's office looking for love. He had come because he needed functional labor, and his priest had told him remarrying was the Christian solution. Coralie's father, Coralie Audet, had borrowed money from Lucien's brother-in-law 18 months ago, and had been creatively forgetting to repay it ever since. The arrangement, as it was explained to Coralie in clipped, business-like language the evening before, was straightforward. She would go north. She would manage the household. The debt would be considered settled. If she found the situation intolerable after 1 year, she was free to leave. No one mentioned where she was supposed to go. She didn't cry. She had cried all of it out in the woodshed the night before, crouched behind the splitting block with her knuckles pressed against her teeth so her father wouldn't hear. By morning, there was nothing left. What remained was something harder and quieter that she did not yet have a name for. Lucien Gagnon glanced at her once when her father signed the paper. His eyes were a flat, pale gray, the color of ice over deep water. They catalogued her the way you'd assess a piece of equipment. Roughly her size, likely functional, condition, acceptable. Then he looked away. The drive north took 4 hours on roads that stopped being roads after the first 2. The truck was a '53 Ford the color of old mustard, and it smelled of chainsaw oil, wet dog, and something she couldn't identify that she later learned was bear lard used for waterproofing boots. Lucien drove in absolute silence, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the gravel track threading through the spruce. The heater worked on one side. It was not her side. Coralie stared out the window and watched civilization thin and disappear. The towns gave way to farms, the farms to woodlots, the woodlots to a wall of forest that seemed to lean in over the truck as they climbed. By the time they crossed the last wooden bridge and followed the track of a long ridge through the black spruces, the sky had gone the deep purple gray of an old bruise. The house appeared at the top of the rise like an argument. It was a long, low structure of squared logs and board and batten additions that seemed to have been added across decades without any particular architectural conviction. Smoke came from 2 chimneys, light burned behind 2 windows. As the truck rolled to a stop in the frozen mud of the yard, the front door opened. They stood on the porch in a row. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 13, held a splitting axe with the ease of someone who had been doing it since he could lift one. His hair was dark like his father's, his jaw already set in a line of pure hostility. Beside him, a girl of 11 with a braid falling apart, holding her younger sister's wrist in a grip that communicated something between protection and restraint. The younger girl, maybe 8, stared openly with enormous dark eyes. Behind them all, wrapped in an adult man's wool sweater with the sleeves rolled 4 times, A small boy of about 5 pressed his nose against the porch railing and regarded the truck with more genuine curiosity than any of his siblings. Coralie stepped out of the truck. The cold hit her like a door slamming. She was wearing town shoes. "Her name is Coralie," Lucien said, walking past them all into the house. "She's here to cook and keep the place. Treat her with respect." The oldest boy's eyes found hers. They were gray like his father's, but where Lucien's were hollow, the boy's, Felix, were burning. He looked at her the way you look at something that has arrived in your house without permission and installed itself in a chair you considered yours. "We had Madame Audet," he said, "before." "I know," Coralie said. She didn't know anything about Madame Audet. "I'm not her." She picked up her carpetbag and walked past all 4 of them into the house. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Stale grease, wet wool left too long in a pile, something burnt on the stove that nobody had bothered to scrape off. The kitchen table had 3 plates still on it from what appeared to have been supper 2 nights ago. The floor was tracked with mud that had dried into a permanent topography. The wood stove was functional, but ringed with a crust of spilled soup. Beside the sink, a mountain of dishes. Coralie stood in the middle of it and breathed through her nose, slowly, deliberately. She set her bag on the cleanest corner of the table. She took off her coat and hung it on a nail by the door. She rolled up her sleeves. "Someone show me where the water pump is," she said to the room. Nobody moved. The small boy, the one with the oversized sweater, his name turned out to be Noel, slid off the bench and said, in a voice like a small earnest bell, "It's outside by the woodshed. It freezes sometimes. You have to hit it." "Good," Coralie said. "Come show me." The first week was not a trial. It was a siege. Lucien left every morning before light, taking his foreman Arsenault and 2 other men up to the cut blocks above the lake. He returned after dark, ate whatever she'd managed to produce, said approximately nothing, and went to bed. On the 3rd morning, she found a pile of split wood added to the stack by the back door that hadn't been there the night before. He had done it in the dark, at what must have been 5 in the morning, before the rest of the house stirred. She stared at that pile for a long time. It was not kindness, exactly. It was maintenance, the way you'd oil a hinge. She told herself that was fine. Felice was the problem. Not in the way that shouting children are problems, but in the way that cold, calculating resistance is a problem. He didn't yell. He didn't throw things. He simply moved through the house, undoing whatever she did, with the efficiency of someone who had decided very early that his cooperation was not for sale. He let the wood box run empty the morning she'd planned to bake. He fed the dog the beans she'd been soaking overnight. He spoke about her in the 3rd person while standing 3 feet away, directing his remarks to his sister Isabel in a low voice that was designed precisely to be heard. "She doesn't know how Papa takes his coffee," he said one evening, watching Coralie pour from the pot. "Black," Coralie said without turning around. "No sugar. I watched the first morning." Silence. "She sets the plates wrong," he continued after a pause. "The plates are flat objects. They go flat side down. There's not much room for interpretation." She set his plate in front of him and pulled out her own chair. "Eat." Isabel, the 11-year-old, watched all of this with eyes that missed nothing. She was the harder one to read. She didn't join her brother's campaign, but she didn't break from it either. She helped sometimes, silently, without acknowledgement, and other times simply disappeared into the back of the house for hours. The younger girl, Audet, followed Coralie at a distance of about 6 feet for the first 4 days, saying nothing but watching everything. On the 5th day, she appeared in the kitchen while Coralie was making touressière and asked, without preamble, "Do you know how to make crêpes?" "Yes," Coralie said. "Maman made them on Sunday." Coralie set down the rolling pin. She looked at the girl, her dark, serious eyes, the way she held her own hands, and felt something shift behind her ribs that she did not want to name right now. Not here. Not in this kitchen she barely knew how to navigate. Then we'll make crepes on Sunday, Coralie said. You can show me how your mother did it. Odette looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and climbed up onto the stool beside the counter. It was not warmth, it was a negotiation, but Coralie would take it. The breaking point came on a Wednesday. She had spent the morning hauling water because the pump had frozen again, hacking at the ice with the back of a hatchet for 20 minutes in -15 before coaxing a trickle. Her knuckles were split from the cold and the scrubbing. She had a pot of pea soup on the stove that had taken 2 hours, dried salt pork simmered down to something almost good, heavy bread cooling on the rack. She had done the washing. She had gotten Noel dressed and his teeth cleaned and found his other mitten behind the wood box where the dog had been sleeping on it. She was tired in a way that lived in the structure of her bones. Felix came in from outside, trailing mud in a deliberate track across the clean floor, looked at the table she'd set, and said, perfectly pleasantly, to no one in particular, Madame Ole's soup didn't look like that. The ladle was in her hand. Coralie set it down very carefully on the edge of the pot. She turned around. She looked at him. This 13-year-old boy with his father's eyes and his dead mother's grief wrapped around him like armor. And she felt the hot, clean edge of real fury. Felice, she said. Her voice was very quiet. The quieter she got, she had always found, the more people listened. I know exactly what I am in this house. I know I was arranged for like a furniture delivery. I know you didn't choose this, and neither did I. She stepped toward him. He held his ground, but his jaw tightened. But I have been up since 4:30. My hands are bleeding. I made your soup and your bread, and I found your brother's mitten, and I scrubbed this floor twice this week, and I am going to stand in this kitchen, and I am going to feed you, and I am going to do it again tomorrow. Not because I was paid to, because there is food and you need to eat it and someone has to be the adult. She picked up the ladle. Sit down, she said, and take your boots off at the door. I'm not asking again. Felix stared at her. The kitchen was very quiet. Odette had gone completely still on her stool. Noel watched from the doorway with wide, interested eyes. Very slowly, Felix bent and pulled off his boots. He set them beside the door. He walked to the table. He sat down. Coralie turned back to the stove and ladled soup. Her hands were shaking, and she was glad her back was to them all. That night, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its particular nighttime silence, the wind off the ridge, the creak of the log walls contracting in the cold, she sat at the kitchen table alone with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. She heard Lucien's boots on the back step, the familiar sound of him knocking the snow off before coming in. He came through the kitchen on the way to hang up his coat. He paused in the doorway. She looked like, she imagined, exactly what she was. Exhausted. Wrung out. Sitting in a kitchen that smelled of pea soup and pine, in a house she hadn't chosen, in a life she hadn't designed. Felix, he said. Not a question. He's fine, she said. He's 13 and he's angry. He's allowed. Lucien was quiet for a moment. He came into the kitchen. He pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. Not close, not touching, just present, and set his big forearms on the table. He looked at her split knuckles around the mug. The pump, he said. It freezes. I know how to manage it now. I'll look at the fitting tomorrow. It shouldn't do that. It would help, she said honestly. He nodded. The fire popped in the wood stove. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the silence was the particular profound silence of deep bush. In winter, a silence that has weight and texture. They're not bad children, he said. I know that. She looked at the mug. They're grieving. That's different. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd gotten into his truck 3 weeks ago. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was something other than the equipment assessment look from the notary's office. Go to bed, Coralie, he said, not unkindly. You've done enough for one day. She stood. She rinsed her mug at the sink. She stopped at the door to the hallway. "Your coffee is in the pot," she said. "I left it on low." She didn't look back. She heard the creak of his chair as he reached for the pot. November brought snow that meant business. Not the tentative early-season snow of the South, the decorative kind. This was the North's declaration of intent. It came overnight and kept coming, burying the woodshed to its eaves, sealing the track down to the road, cutting the Gagnon property into its own island at the top of the world. Coralie shoveled a path to the woodpile every morning. Her arms stopped hurting after the second week. She simply became stronger. The children adapted. Felix never apologized. She didn't expect him to, but the act of sabotage stopped. He started splitting extra wood on Saturdays without being asked, leaving it stacked by the back step. She noticed. She didn't mention it. Some things are better left as private understandings between people who will never discuss them. Isabel began appearing in the kitchen in the evenings, sitting at the far end of the table with a school book, ostensibly doing homework, but in practice simply occupying the same space. Occasionally she would ask a question. About the recipe, about nothing. It was her version of a peace offering, and Coralie understood it. Noel had been hers from the second day. He was 5 years old and transparently delighted to have a woman in the house who answered his questions and did not tell him to go play. He trailed her through the kitchen, handing her things she didn't need, providing a running commentary on the dog's activities and the birds at the window feeder. She found she didn't mind. It was Noel who came to her at 2 a.m. in mid-November. He appeared in the doorway of her small room off the kitchen, the one that had been the pantry and still smelled faintly of preserved fruit. His face was pale. His lips were lavender. "Odette won't wake up," he said. Coralie was up and moving before he finished the sentence. Odette was on her side in the bed she shared with Isabel, and she was breathing wrong, fast and shallow, with a sound underneath it like paper tearing. When Coralie pressed the back of her hand to the girl's forehead, the heat nearly made her pull back. It was not a fever. It was a furnace. "Lucian." She crossed the hall and knocked twice hard. He opened the door already half awake, the way men who work dangerous jobs learn to sleep, barely, always listening. "Odette," Coralie said. That was all. He was past her before she finished the word. The road down the mountain was iced over and impassable. The truck wouldn't make it before morning at the earliest, and the nearest hospital was 90 minutes on a clear road. The radio phone crackled with a response from the nurse in Sainte-Adèle, who talked them through what she could and promised to send someone at first light if they couldn't get out. What followed was the longest night of Coralie's adult life. She worked the way her mother had worked through hard things, without drama, without stopping. She boiled water and cut it with snow to get the temperature right, wrapping heated cloths around Odette's feet and neck to pull the fever down from the edges. She made a steam tent with the quilt and a pot of water with dried thyme from the pantry, crouching under it with the girl, holding her upright, talking low and steady even when Odette was too delirious to respond. She learned very quickly that it didn't matter if she was listened to. What mattered was the voice, something to hold on to. Felix stayed up the whole night. He sat outside the bedroom door on the floor, with his back to the wall, and said nothing. But when Coralie came out to get more water or more cloths, he was always there, awake, watching her with something she hadn't seen before on his face, not defiance, something open. The second time she came out at around 3 a.m, he said quietly, "Is she going to be okay?" "I don't know yet," Coralie said, because she didn't, and he was 13, and he had already lost his mother to a lie dressed as comfort. She would not do that to him, but she's fighting, and I'm not going anywhere. He nodded. He pulled his knees up to his chest and stared at the floor. She went back in. By 4:30, the fever had dropped a fraction. By 6, Odette was breathing more easily, the tearing sound smoothed out into something more like sleep. When Lucian put his hand on his daughter's forehead, and the muscle in his jaw released slightly, Coralie sat down on the floor against the wall, because her legs had decided they were done. She heard him cross the room. She felt him crouch down beside her. Close this time. actually close. He looked at her, the wrecked hair, the dark circles, the hands she couldn't quite stop shaking. "She's sleeping," Coralie said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "The fever's dropping. She needs watching, but I think she's through the worst." Lucian was quiet for a long moment. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. It was enormous, his hand, calloused and heavy and very warm. He didn't say anything, he just held her hand still. "Go lie down," he said finally. "I have the morning." She wanted to argue. She opened her mouth and then closed it. For the first time in 6 weeks, she let someone else take the watch. She slept for 4 hours on the narrow pantry bed and woke to the sound of Noel and Isabel in the kitchen, talking in low voices, and the smell of coffee, and sunlight, coming hard and white off the snow outside her window. When she came out, Lucian was at the stove with his back to her, spatula in hand, attempting pancakes with the grim concentration of a man doing something outside his expertise. The first one was burnt. He scraped it off the pan without looking up. "The pan's too hot," Coralie said. "I know that now." She came and stood beside him and adjusted the damper on the stove without asking. He moved over fractionally to give her room. They stood side by side in the morning light and made breakfast. And it was not romantic, and it was not simple, but it was the first time they had occupied the same space without edges. Winter ran its full sentence on them, and then, finally, loosened. March came with the particular violent optimism of Canadian spring. The snow turning gray and granular at the edges, the south-facing slopes going bare in patches, the creek under the ice beginning to murmur and shift. The air still had teeth, but the light was different. The light was coming back. Coralie had been on the ridge for 5 months. She was not the same person who had gotten into the yellow truck outside the notary's office. She was harder in the hands and the shoulders, and quieter in some internal way that was not sadness, but economy. She had learned what mattered, and dropped what didn't. She could split her own kindling. She could navigate the track on snowshoes in the dark. She knew where the pump seized and how to fix it. She knew that Felix needed to be asked directly and not managed sideways, and that Isabel thought in long, slow loops and deserved time. She knew that Noel's happiness was structurally simple and deserved protection. She knew that Lucian communicated primarily through what he did rather than what he said, and that you had to learn to read the language. When the Gagnon truck came down into Sainte-Adèle in the second week of March for supplies, people stared. There had been talk. There is always talk in small towns about arrangements like theirs, and the talk had not been kind. She had heard some of it second-hand through Isabel, who repeated things with the particular flat accuracy of a child reporting news without understanding all of its weight. She had heard that people expected her gone by November. She had heard that people felt sorry for her. She had heard that some people felt the whole situation was a scandal, and said so loudly in the parking lot of the church. Coralie walked into the hardware store behind Lucian and found 3 men she didn't know going quiet in that particular way. That means they know you. She needed caulking compound, 2 new hinges, and a box of nails in the 3-inch size. She said this to the man behind the counter, clearly, without preamble, and watched him fumble to respond. From somewhere in the back of the store, someone said, with the studied casualness of something that was meant to be heard, "That the Gagnon woman?" "Her name is Coralie Audet," Lucian said. He had come in behind her and he said it at his normal volume, which was not loud, but in the quiet of the store it carried to every corner. He stepped up to the counter beside her and set down his own list. "I'll pay for both orders together." He didn't touch her. He didn't make a declaration. He simply stood there, his full considerable height, his presence that took up room the way a load-bearing wall takes up room, and the silence in the store shifted into something more careful. She looked up at him briefly, sideways. He looked straight ahead at the man behind the counter, waiting. That was all. That was enough. They loaded the truck in the parking lot, and Felice arranged the lumber with the efficiency he brought to everything physical, while Isabel negotiated with Noel over who was sitting where. Lucien handed Coralie a paper bag with a waxed paper package inside. She opened it. 2 maple sugar candies from the dépanneur across the street, the flat kind pressed in the shape of maple leaves. She looked at them. She looked at him. He was already turning back to the truck, checking the tie-down on the lumber with the back of his hand. "Felix mentioned you have a sweet tooth," he said, without turning around. She wrapped the bag shut. She climbed up into the cab. The drive back up the mountain was 4 hours of gravel and incline, and the particular beauty of the Laurentians in early spring. The mountains still white above the tree line, the valleys beginning to show the gray-green suggestion of what was coming. Noel fell asleep between the first and second hour, his head against Coralie's arm. She let him stay. The weight of a sleeping child was a specific and unreasonable comfort, and she had learned not to argue with comfort where she found it. Lucien drove. The road wound up through the black spruces. Neither of them spoke, but it was the silence of people who have said enough already without speaking and know it. Near the top of the last rise, where the track cleared the trees and the full view opened up, the ridge, the valley below, the house with its smoke rising straight in the cold air, he said, without turning from the wheel, "I'd like you to stay." He did not say it the way someone says something they've rehearsed. He said it the way you say something you've been deciding in pieces for a long time and have finally assembled completely. A flat, plain statement, the most honest kind. Coralie looked at the smoke rising from the house. She thought about the pump and the flour bin, and Odette's crimps on Sunday, and Felix's split wood by the back step, and a ladle held too tightly in a hand that shook. She thought about who she had been in October and who she was now, and whether those two people were even on speaking terms. "All right," she said. "Not a performance, not a decision being performed for an audience, just a fact, settling into place like a stone finding the bottom of a lake." The truck rolled to a stop in the yard. The dog barked from the porch. The smoke rose straight and white against the pale March sky. Coralie Audet stepped out of the truck onto ground that was finally, grudgingly, beginning to thaw, and she did not look back at the road that ran down off the mountain toward a town that had expected her to fail. She went inside to start the stove. "I keep thinking about that pile of split wood by the back step, the one Felix left there without saying a word, without being asked, sometime in November when the ground had already frozen solid and nobody was watching. That's the moment I come back to, more than any other. Not the big scenes, not the night with Odette and the fever, not the hardware store. That quiet pile of wood left by a 13-year-old boy who had decided, somewhere in himself, to stop fighting. I think about what it takes to get from one place to the other, from the person who is fighting to the person who leaves wood by the step. And I don't think it's a single decision. I don't think it happens the way stories sometimes tell it, in one dramatic turn. I think it happens the way ice thaws, which is imperceptibly and then all at once and mostly in the dark when no one is watching. Coralie didn't win Felix over by being kind to him. She won him over by being honest with him, by telling him the truth about Odette when he asked. "I don't know if she's going to be okay, but I'm not going anywhere," instead of the comfortable lie that would have been easier to give. That kind of honesty takes something. It takes knowing the difference between what people want to hear and what they actually need, and being willing to offer the harder thing even when you're exhausted and frightened yourself. That's not sentiment. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't get talked about enough. And then there's what it took just to stay upright through all of it. The pump that froze. The mud tracked across a floor she'd just cleaned. The silence at a table that had decided not to welcome her. I think people underestimate what that costs over time. Not the dramatic moments, but the accumulation of ordinary hard days where you just have to keep going because there isn't another option. Coralie didn't have a plan. She had a decision she kept making every morning before it was even light, which is maybe the only kind of plan that actually holds. What strikes me most, looking back at her story, is that she never tried to be what anyone expected. Not the broken girl the town predicted. Not a replacement for a woman she'd never known. She just kept being precisely herself. Direct, unglamorous, capable, and let that be enough. There's something in that I find steadier than any advice I've ever been given. You don't have to perform your way through hard things. You just have to show up in them, honestly, and do the next thing that needs doing. The road off that mountain led back to a town that had already written her off. She didn't look at it when she got out of the truck. She went inside to start the stove. That's the whole lesson, really. Not in the looking back. In the starting the stove.